Are we live?
Yes, we're live, although it's not showing your full screen yet.
We're live. We're live. Ben?
Yes, we're live, but it's showing only part of your screen.
Only part of my screen.
Can you full screen your Zoom?
Yes, I can.
All right, go ahead.
Hey, it's Alex Williams, the New Stack, and this is our first live stream. It's a test. We are here with the editorial team of the New Stack, and we thought we'd use this testing time to review the stories of the week. And I first want to introduce who we have here today. We have Job Jackson, our managing editor. Hello, Job.
Hello.
Scott Fulton, editor and producer at the New Stack.
Good afternoon, Alex. How are you?
Great. And Lawrence Hecht, our research manager.
Hey.
Good. So we're going to go through 3 stories, doing a little test here, seeing how this live streaming goes. We're kind of trying it on different platforms, on Facebook Live, on YouTube, and Periscope. So, Job, why don't you tell us what stories we're going to look at and start with your own thoughts and perspectives?
Sure, Alex. The 3 stories we'll review this week. Number 1 will be the disagreements over that are happening in the NodeJS technical committee, steering committee.
And Job's in LA. As you can tell, there's sirens.
Story number 2 is an arrest outside Job's hotel.
If you only knew. And how that might lead to a fork. The second news story is some interesting news from VMWorld this week. The Pivotal Cloud Foundry has been integrated with Google Cloud. And that is interesting, not merely because the Cloud Foundry users can really get onto Google Cloud really easily, but it sets up a way for them to get on other clouds as well through a driver, which Scott will talk about. And I figured for the third story, we'll talk a bit about serverless. Late last week, one of our authors, Mark Boyd, wrote an interesting piece about the remaining questions that are swirling around serverless. And so we will talk about some of the issues that he had brought up. All right, so the first topic is the possible forking of the Node.js code base. And this is actually a number of people in who are working for the technical steering committee were unhappy about the presence of one particular individual. We won't name his name. From all accounts, he's a really nice guy. And in fact, he is a follower on our Twitter. But really, the issue, as these people are putting it, is not so much with this one individual, but the fact that the board at the Node.js, the board for Node.js, is not responding to what they say are clearly repeated violations of the project's code of conduct. So this is interesting for a number of reasons. Number 1, it's interesting because this is the second time in, I think, almost 2 years that Node has been forked. And for software that portends to be for the enterprise, this does not bode well for its stability. This is also links into a number of cultural issues, and it raises a question, and this has come up with other the Linux kernel, for instance, where Linus Torvalds has been a little bit less than diplomatic with some contributors, and causing a similar round of complaints about how the organization is not really responding to all of its members, and it's not being as inclusive as it needs to be. Now, this is interesting because, I grew up with the Linux and the open source way of doing things, and it was always technocratic. If you knew your stuff, then it was diverse in that way. It didn't matter who you were. it will only matter that you knew that you were bringing something to the table. But is it enough to possibly fork a project to make sure that everybody gets heard at the table? I mean, that's the question it raises. I don't know what thoughts everybody has about that.
I think it's not, if we're not necessarily being specific to this, to the potential forking of Node.js here, but looking at the dynamics of the group interaction. I think it says something that a group feels that it should actually have to divide and pull away and be over here in a different realm in order to be inclusive. There's a bit of duality in that, having to create exclusivity so that we can be inclusive of the people who are exclusive to us. I'm a little fishy about that. One of the things, if anybody's ever seen the movie The American President, President Shepard, who's brilliantly portrayed by Michael Douglas, says something about democracy. It says democracy is not easy. You gotta want it. You gotta include people whose points of view would make your skin crawl, but you've got to fight for the death for their right to have all those points of view, which is nice up until the point where they start infringing upon the civil rights of the people who are actually included in your group. And then when they start infringing, then you got to start thinking about how you can move these people into exclusivity. But what does that say for the project? Making the project separate in order to achieve this inclusiveness. I'm wondering whether that's actually a necessary step. Lots of open source groups have had people who have infringed upon their standards and practices and have impugned about the rights of individuals, and those people should be removed. But I wonder whether it's necessary to take that extra step of creating a boundary and creating an us and themness. That seems to be antithetical to me, the whole idea of open source.
Lawrence, go ahead, Joe.
Oh, no, I was just going to take the opportunity to comment on the irony of 4 old white guys talking about diversity.
Yeah.
But please, continue, Alex.
Yeah, I was going to just ask Lawrence, because we've been doing some research on open source communities and looking at a lot of the composition of these communities and how these other communities are fairly stable. Would you agree with that, Lawrence? Or is there a corollary, a comparison you can make between the Node communities and the other communities that you have researched?
Yeah. Well, first, the Node community is different than most of the other projects I'm looking at because there is no one corporate sponsor. There's no locus of, there's no Red Hat or Google where that they make up 30% or more of the contributors. That's number one. What I see with Node and almost everything else is it's still 90% male, 95% sometimes, and that the biggest challenge for the females is that they don't want to get involved because of the code of conduct. But interestingly, the GitHub did a survey of what makes people want to participate and contribute and use an open source project. Only women were much more likely to care about codes of conduct and rules for interacting on the community than men. So basically, but it was only like 100 out of like 2,000 people, or 100 out of, it was
small percentage.
Very small percentage. It was smaller than the actual representation in the community of women who were actually participating. But the point being is that women care a lot, men don't care as much. And one of the big issues with what happened in this Node.js situation is that this guy basically pushed the boundaries of being, I'll say, not being diplomatic, but every time someone talked about trying to be inclusive in a very broad sense, he has a different point of view. He was of a different, let's say, political persuasion, and that's actually the norm. That's what a lot of people think, but they're scared to say. They're scared to say it because the smaller percentage of people, we'll say the women in the not just women, but liberals, like a lot of us are, would rail against him. So that's actually the challenge, is that the people with more conservative viewpoints and who don't want to actually who resent some of the attempts for diversity, they feel like they're not heard, and that's what happened with the Node.js situation. The problem is that everyone has to be realistic and understand that they're bothering other people, and if they're bothering other people, they should be told to stop bothering them. So, for the example being, is that if I was if I respond to every time Alex tweets something out, if I rate a response and I expect him to respond back, he's going to block me eventually. And that's his right to do so. And that's unfortunate. But that's
a choice.
Blame. Yeah. So you could take that to what's happening here. I'm sorry if I pushed out besides the data.
I think we probably need to move on to other topics. My last point would be is like one of the things that you often hear is like, let's talk about technology. Let's not talk about these issues that we have inside these communities. But to me, that's absolutely absurd because how can you separate people and technology? It's just actually impossible. I mean, if the open source community is actually building the technology, then that's just the assumption. So how can you kind of totally separate these? I think more so people are wanting to just focus on the innovation, the exciting stuff. But that really requires a community to do it in an open source way. Joe, what's next?
Excellent. Next is we have dispatched Scott Fulton to Las Vegas to
Where?
go.
Oh, yes.
VMware. That's where. And you get some interesting news about Pivotal Cloud Foundry. And there's a lot going on in the article, and I'd love to have you dive a bit more into what it all means. But at the top level, it's basically that Pivotal Cloud Foundry can now, those using Cloud Foundry, I guess in general, can now easily migrate to the Google Cloud Platform. Please explain it better than I'm explaining it now.
Well, I will say this. I would be cautioned, probably, especially by some of the people at Cloud Foundry Foundation, that this innovation that was announced this week at VMworld 2017 Las Vegas really does go beyond Cloud Foundry. It's more about, it's not just about cloud native applications and moving those into homogenized infrastructure. This is about getting containerized applications in general, and I'll explain. Cloud Foundry has had a couple of projects that have gone broader than CF and gone into a much more generalized application. One has been the Open Service Broker API, which we've covered a lot of times here in the new stack. And Open Service Broker is essentially a means for an abstract service to contact another abstract service, regardless of where they are deployed, so that they can communicate, share information, share instructions on what to do next, get coordinated with one another. This is a very essential piece of technology, and it's done in such an obviously good fashion that even some of the OpenStack folks have adopted the Open Service Broker API, even though it's come from the Cloud Foundry community. And another one is WASH. WASH is this methodology for automating the deployment of applications to a service. It's a fairly simple command line tool. There's not a heck of a lot of complexity to it from the usage standpoint, but it relegates all these huge, ultra long configuration files that you normally have to do if you're doing microservices, it relegates them to a process that kind of generates these configurations based on a desired state and does its best to push these applications out to the cloud based on a much simpler configuration.
Is that similar to Habitat or no?
Kind of, because it's less like Habitat. A lot of folks have said that that Habitat and Chef they use configurations that you then save like recipes, and you kind of have to file them away. Bosch's idea is try to do as much as you can to accommodate the application or accommodate the workload at the expense of the server. The heck with the server. We really don't care about the server. The server is not going to run. We'll kind of cancel that out. We're going to move the service someplace else. It keeps the applications running. And that's the whole point of that. So what then getting to the announcement, the actual announcement, is that Pivotal, which happens to be the commercial steward of Cloud Foundry, has come forth with Pivotal Container Service. The abbreviation for that is PKS, the way that Google Container Engine's abbreviation is GKE. And the reason for that K is kind of to throw a little nod to Google is that it's a little bit hardwired right now into Google Cloud as the public cloud side of the deployment platform. So what happens is Pivotal Container Service is a commercial BOSH. It uses Kubo, which is Kubernetes BOSH mixed together. In effect, BOSH platform for Kubernetes to deploy general workloads that would normally run in your average Kubernetes cluster, to deploy them in a Google Cloud environment, or a mixed environment where you have your own premises, servers, and Google Cloud. And right now it's Google Cloud, and maybe it'll be something else for right now, for the near future. I think Google Cloud is going to have that exclusive placement, and there's probably good reason for that. There are a lot of Google engineers who are involved. Lawrence, you have a question.
Why do people dislike Bosch so much? When I saw a lot of comments about Bosch on Twitter the other day saying, well, this will be great, except for Bosch has a lot of problems.
Well, a lot of people's, a lot of IT administrative jobs right now have been tuned toward keeping the servers active, keeping the servers performing, keeping them at a particular service level. And they've got a lot of server focus. Bosch comes from a very different political background. It really says, to heck with, insert profanity here, to heck with the servers. Really don't care that much about the servers. It's a matter of getting the service levels accommodated as best as possible by judging what's happening from the workload point of view. And there were some great sessions from Colin Humphreys, who was a CEO and a CTO in his own right, who's moved over and is now very much in charge of getting Bosch and Kubo working on Pivotal Container Service and Google Cloud. And it was really demonstrating through the use of a lot of people who saw it know his many uses of the nuclear mushroom cloud to show what really happens in production when you are focused on keeping the servers maintained and the servers going. It was a nightmare for him in his career. This is a very, very different political point of view. It's opinionated toward the workload, and a lot of people are going to say that's a lot nicer, that's a lot better. Joe,
Bosch was also started as a Google project, right?
No.
Yes, Google.
Yes.
Bosch started as a Google project? I thought it was I thought it came out of VMware with Cloud Foundry.
No, Kubo started out of VMware and Cloud Foundry as a way of, let's put it this way. Bosch was implemented on a Cloud Foundry platform first. So they've got that. But the project, as far as the engineers were concerned, they started at Google. They started apportioning a lot more Cloud Foundry people as time went on, and then getting VMwares and Pivotals. I think VMware by way of Pivotal.
Okay.
So it sounds like I can run my own PaaS on top of Google and, provided AWS and Azure also come up with the connectors, any other cloud that I want.
Yeah, demonstrated on stage during the day 2 keynotes. It was really apparent that what they want to be able to do is essentially, 30 seconds, spin up your Kubernetes clusters, 30 more seconds, maybe a minute, get your application running. Right now, what that does is kind of steps up into a command line and gives you a couple of pointers on how to input your BOSH command. But in the future, there's probably going to be a lot more direct user experience, shall we say, because this is going to be integrated more and more and more into vSphere, which is very important because it's vSphere that is going into direct competition with OpenStack and will be the major competitor as far as getting platform integration and getting virtual infrastructure services up there. So what vSphere users will be able to do, what all vSphere users will be able to do, regardless of whether they even touch Cloud Foundry, is use two of Cloud Foundry's major components to take their containerized workloads, put them up into vSphere clouds, run them on VMs, and manage them just like any other VM in the cloud.
Just for correction, BOSH was originally developed by VMware. In 2010,
Thanks, Alex. I do stand corrected.
Yeah, in 2010, to deploy Cloud Foundry, it's also used to deploy other software such as Hadoop, RabbitMQ, or MySQL.
Okay.
So should we? Thank you for that summary. To me, it kind of like reflects on, how OpenShift is positioned in the market right now with Google, and now Pivotal Cloud Foundry Pivotal Container Service is positioned with Google. We don't see any positioning we see Azure positioning with Kubernetes. We see we see AWS starting to show more support for Kubernetes and join the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So the chess game continues. And the question for me is, why would you ever need BOSH? I guess it's just because there's so many users out there who do know BOSH. And so this provides Kubernetes as an infrastructure that has a lot of flexibility in terms of how you can use it for various different kinds of workloads. Why don't we move on to a discussion on serverless? And I know Lawrence is very interested in the serverless technology space. Joe, what's the summary of the story? What did Mark Boyd do in this article?
Excellent. Well, Mark Boyd, he'd actually talked to some of the folks at the CNCF about the upcoming serverless conf event in New York in October. And the CNCF is actually working on a kind of a definition paper about what are the outstanding issues that have to do, I guess, with the serverless architecture in general. And so they're working with some high-level questions. And Mark took a look at three of the big kind of questions that are now floating around serverless. And they are, in a nutshell, is number one, is something serverless? Is that the same thing as a function as a service? Are you just executing a function? Or is serverless, can you equivocate that with event-driven architecture? Is it one or is the other? Is it different from both of those? That's an interesting question. There's also questions around, what is the standardization efforts going on? Are we going back to the first days of the cloud, where each serverless service is kind of unique on its own, and then it forces organizations to write to that particular serverless service? Or will we get to the point where there'll be a Kubernetes for serverless, a kind of broker that would reduce serverless services to kind of a commodity? And the third question is, of course, questions around reliability. How do you know? How do you monitor serverless to make sure it's working accurately? There's some studies going on about AWS and others, and they're showing a lot of varying results. And on top of the three questions, there's also a lot of talk, and this comes from a recent essay from Matt Essay about can serverless replace containers altogether? Containers will always be needed on an infrastructure level, but for the average enterprise, can they just leapfrog over the whole adopting to containers bit and just go directly into realigning their enterprise serverless functions. So yeah, a lot of questions around this nascent space. Now, sometimes I like for fun, I'll poke Lawrence to get his opinions on whether something like serverless can replace containers, because I know, Lawrence, you have a lot to say on that.
I just repeat what other people tell me. But
you do not. You
synthesize.
You repeat what I tell you.
Yeah.
Maybe. So basically, from when I talk to people, a developer is going to develop applications and deploy applications to different form factors, being a computer or mobile device, a server, whatever. But they're also going to be using different compute abstractions. In this case, the question is, are they going to be deploying their applications to host a physical server or virtual server? Are they going to be deploying it to a container, or are they going to be deploying it to via function?
Right.
And you don't have to choose. I know a couple companies, two companies where I can't talk about them right now, but their long-term model is to have a continuous deployment dashboard where you could choose via Chinese menu of, I want to deploy this application to a VM, this application to a container. I want to use for another part of the application, I want to be able to use functions from a third cloud provider. That's a vision that I think is compelling to me, and I think that's going to happen. Now, the biggest issue is when you were saying, is someone going to jump over from passing over containers to
Directly
to functions, and to be able to do that, you have to have already have microservices maturity. I hate using the word maturity, but you have to have.
We hate maturity around here.
You have to have a continuous deployment system and integration system that makes sense. You have to have already start to decompose your applications into groups. So basically, there's a continuum there. You really can't take a huge jump. People are taking huge jumps for specific use cases where they're going to save. Sometimes when they're saving a lot of money, but just because sometimes when it's a lot easier. So like with big data, people are able to pass over some data processing functions for their application to a third party, and then have the data come back, and that's serverless in a lot of ways, and it's using a functions as a service type of provider. Like Spark is being used in this way, but at the same time that they're using VMs at the same time, and they can be using containers at the same time. Scott uses the term heterogeneous. I can keep on talking about. I'll give someone else time.
The thing I like about serverless is it offloads the problem of distributed systems to the service provider. We had an essay from Ann Curry, a very good essay about why distributed systems, they're hard to build and they're hard to manage. And this is something that supercomputing community has known for decades. And I think it's just starting to be rediscovered in the microservices community. So in that way, just because an enterprise doesn't have to deal with distributed systems architecture, which is not something you're going to pick up immediately as a sysadmin, that's a big headache relief. On the other hand, there's still dependencies, there's still libraries that need to be updated, and that's, as far as I can tell, that seems to still have to take place on the user side, and they could do it via CI/CD in containers or through Habitat or through some other means. But it doesn't sound like fast solves all the problems of dealing with these scalable systems, basically.
Yeah, I think the thing that service providers absolutely hate about serverless architecture is that it offloads the problem of distributed systems to the service providers.
Right.
And there's the rub. Essentially, somebody's going to get that problem. Now, if we had this DevOps culture where the developers and the operators were working together, some people have argued to me, well, then we'd be working together on solving the problems instead of passing them over each other's wall or falling them over each other's net to see who gets the next. That said, there is a beauty of serverless architecture from a developer's perspective. Abstracting away the dependencies and concentrating on the problem at hand is necessary in order to create a good, tight, stateless function that can be very well distributed. So it lends itself very well to that. That said, it is a postponement of the inevitable problem of resolving dependency until some later time. So it's serverlessness, but not perpetual. At some point, you have to have some type of system which makes the resolution. And it would be nice if while at the same time you're making the abstractions easier for the developer to cope with, you have some type of an automated platform on the operator's perspective that is doing this resolution in an automated fashion and making it easier for them to cope with as well. And then they can have a DevOps party Friday night and they can bring chips and beer.
Woohoo!
There's one thing that I think we didn't mention, and that's app developers sometimes care about performance that's related to the server. And so the biggest issue is like, how do you monitor that? And how are you dealing with like the cold start issues? But that right now, developers are engineering around that and doing all use cases because of certain limitations. The big question for me is for serverless and otherwise is how much do developers actually need to see of what's happening with the server itself? Because basically what the idea with the containers is that sometimes you're able to tune the applications used by looking at how the underlying infrastructure is being used, but oftentimes you don't need to do that. 90% of the time you don't need to do that. Is it just basically we're telling developers that you have to get over it and get over your interest in being able to solve problems on the infrastructure side?
So yeah, I mean, you have to tune for memory usage, IO usage, that sort of thing. And that's what site reliability engineering is all about, to a certain extent, is the ability to fine tune these kind of low level details to really make an application work. Are you losing that with serverless, or serverless just for those applications where that sort of real-time responsiveness is not paramount?
One of the things that I really liked about the story was the distinction between serverless, fast, and the advent of event-based architectures. And that to me seems like really what we're talking about is this new generation of event-based architectures, event-based services that are going to be increasingly popular. And I think that's the point that often is made about serverless, is that you can have some real efficiencies there. It doesn't have to be constantly. The functions don't have to constantly be running, right? They can be called when needed, and that speaks to kind of a next generation of capabilities that I think are going to be really important when you start to thinking about how do autonomous things actually interact with each other. They're going to have to have some. They're going to have some commands to do that, and then they might then have that adaptive intelligence really to be able to kind of know their surroundings and and what's at issue in terms of what they have to deal with when they're out in the field. But it's that it's that function that's being called from the data center that basically goes down and says, here's the command, and and here's what you need to do, and you can learn, and then they know how to learn from it. And to me, that to me where it seems like this is going. We're moving into this event-based architecture space, and that's going to be what's going to be so important. He did make this point that serverless is bigger than just function as a service. Fast is just your compute layer. Explained this one individual that Mark quoted. If you're running Kafka to feed events into Fast, you've got servers to manage there. If you use AWS, Kinesis instead, you still have to provision for sharding, but your operational load is vastly reduced. And similarly, that's true for all the other parts of an application, the database, the blob storage, authentication layer, encryption, blah, blah, blah. So being serverless is about putting your business logic in fast and using managed services for everything else. So there's so much here, and this is a favorite topic of ours. I was going to suggest that we wrap up. Does anyone else have anything else that they'd like to add here?
I think I'd like to see event-driven architecture continue in this space, like it has in one form or another for the next 30 years. But in order to enable that to happen, you got to have a network flow architecture that handles that tremendously huge and broadening stream of events. You're going to have network flow architecture get bigger. We're going to have to learn some lessons from NFV in order for that to happen.
NFV,
Well,
a favorite.
Dynamics be able to help out when Cisco bought App Dynamics. They're the monitoring company. Can they come together and do something with events? That's something to think about.
Much more to talk about here. Well, thank you all for joining us in this live stream. We have been wanting to get more into live streaming. We're going to be at the Software Circus in Amsterdam next week. We're also going to be at PagerDuty Summit in San Francisco, where Job and Scott will be, and then we'll be doing a little live streaming there. And then we'll be at the Open Source Summit the following week in Los Angeles, where we will be watching all the events there and also doing some podcasting and live streaming. So thank you very much for all you viewers out there who've come to check this out. I'd like to thank Job Jackson. Thanks for helping put this together, Job, and giving us a summary of the stories. Scott Fulton, our editor and producer, and Lawrence Hecht, who does our data research. That's it for today. Have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you very much.
Take care of you and yours.
Okay.